All right, so we'll say good morning. Today's daf is Yud Ches. We have a beautiful, mamish, incredible Gemara today. Our shir this morning is sponsored by Ayal and Sarah Steinberg, and of the upcoming yard site of Ayal's mother, Elia Daphna Bas Yosef. We open on the merit of our Talmud Torah. She will have a complete, her and Hashem will have a complete aliyah, and the family in Nechama. We'll say, let's begin. So first I want to thank you, Huda, for giving the shir over the last couple of days. So we'll say, let's begin. So I know you left off 4 lines down on Yud Ches. I just want to take you back a little bit. Just let's start up 4 lines up from the bottom on Yud Zayin with Beis. Again, we'll do it quickly. So remember, again, we're talking about the interesting sugi about Mechusar Begadim. What happens if a Kohen goes ahead and does the avodah, not wearing all of the requisite big day kahuna? So the Mishnah told me that such an avodah is pasul, right? Such avodah is totally invalidated. Now, by the way, kohanic liability we'll discuss separately, but the avodah is pasul. So the Gemara tried to learn this out from where do we know this from? So at first the Gemara quoted the pasuk, "V'chagarto sam avneit aronu banav v'chavashta lahem migbos v'isol lahem kuhuna l'chukas olam." So the Gemara darshan, when are they kohanim? When do they have the kuhuna? Ultimately, again, when they're wearing the begadim. So in the begadim are problem, they have the kuna. When they're not wearing the begadim, they don't have the kuna. So the Gemara says, but the Gemara says, do we really learn out from there? The Gemara brings out an alternate source. Tisanya minayim l'shtuei yain shem avad chilel. We'll see, how do we know that if a Kohen drank wine and then did the avodah, that the avodah is chilel, literally meaning the avodah is profane, which means the avodah is not good. Talmud lomar yain v'shecher al teisht ulahavdil ben hakodesh ben hachol. So we'll say the Gemara knows the juxtaposition between the prohibition to drink wine and then the pasuk says "Ulahavdil ben hakodesh ben hachol," to distinguish between that which is kodesh and that which is profane, teaching me that what if he doesn't drink wine, the avodah is kodesh. If he does drink wine, the avodah is profane. Now we'll say, now watch this. Here's the part that's important for us. Mechusar begad mishlo rachas yadayim raglayim minayin. We'll say, what about the case of mechusar begadim? What about the case, ultimately, again, of a kohen who does the avodah without the requisite clothing, or did not wash his hands and feet? From where do we know that such avodah is psula as well? Top of Yud Ches, Talmud lomar, chuka l'gzeir shava. So we'll say the Gemara makes a gzeir shava between the pasuk over here of chuka, which is yain v'shecher al teisht, ata uvanecha itoch. So we'll say the Torah uses the word chuka or chukas in the pasuk talking about wine, consumption of wine, and if a kohen consumes wine, then the avodah is pasul. And the Torah uses the same lashon of chukas by the big day kahuna. So we'll say the Gemara therefore makes gzeir shava of chuka. Just like by wine, if a kohen consumes wine, the avodah is pasul. So too, if a kohen does not wear the proper big day kahuna, the avodah is also pasul. Good. So also, so now you hear the kasha. The kasha is where we're learning out. So here's the interesting part. Everyone agrees that's what? That's what? If you right, so wine, true, but again, for our purposes here now, everyone agrees that if the kohen's not wearing the begadim, the avodah is pasul. Okay, everyone agrees. The shaila is, what's the source? We started out by quoting part 1 pasuk. Now the Gemara quotes the gzeir shava. So we'll say it's important for us to know not just what the bottom line halacha is, but ultimately again where the halacha is derived from. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why we need this. Ime hasam hava amina hani mili avoda dizar chayev ala misa. So we'll say, the Gemara says something very interesting. Had we learned out the obligation of, or I should say, the liability of mechusar begadim from the pasuk or from the gzeir shava of shtuye yayin, so we'll say, I would have thought as follows: the hani mili avoda dizar chayev ala misa. When is a kohen Rabbosai, when is he liable if he doesn't wear the big day kahuna? Only if he didn't wear the big day kahuna for one of the avodos, which if performed by a zar, a non-kohen, would bring a death sentence. Aval avoda de'in zar chayiv ala misa imalo. Rabbosai, if a kohen did not wear the begadim during one of the avodos, for which a zar, a non-kohen, would not be liable to death if he did it, then perhaps he shouldn't be chayiv misa. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Imi hasam mishtuye yayin hava mina hani mili demachli avoda b'mechosar begadim b'avoda shazar chayiv ala misa ki dechsev bahukra b'voachem al oamoid v'lo samusu Ba'avoda sheyesh b'chiyuv misa l'psul makasim medaber. So what the Gemara is pointing out over here is as follows. If you learn it out from the pasuk of yain v'shecher al teisht, so we'll say that pasuk is dafka talking about the types of avoda for which one is chayiv misa. So if you go ahead and you drink wine, and then you do one of the avodas, ultimately again that a zara is not permitted to do, then the kohen is chayiv misa. I would have thought if you're learning it out from shtuye yayin, that what? The same halacha applies to mechusar begadim. When is a kohen chayiv if he does the avoda without proper begadim? That's only for the type of avoda that if done by a zar, there would be a chayiv misa. But if he didn't wear the begadim by a type of avoda for which the zar would not be chayiv misa, then perhaps the kohen is not chayiv either. Kamash Mala, no. Kamash will say that we have the Gzera Shava, and Gzera Shava teaches us that what? Chuka. That will say in all cases of avoda, the kohen must wear the begadim. So Ashkechan Mechusar begadim, Shtuye Yayin Minala. So we'll say now I understand that the Isser of Mechusar begadim, the prohibition for a kohen, not for a kohen, or I should say, the obligation for a kohen to wear his big day kahuna applies to all of the avodos. All avodah. If you look at Rashi says, Ashkecha mechusar begadim b'chol ha'avodos, shtuye yayin minalad. Where do we know shtuye yayin? We'll say now, what does Rashi say about shtuye yayin minalad? De pasli avodah she'ein hazar chayev aleha misa. So we'll say, where do we know that by shtuye yayin, even if the kohen drinks wine, that he will be chayev for that, even if it's for the type of avodah for which a zar would not be chayiv misa. To which the Gemara answers, Asya chuka mimuchuscha begadim. Suppose it's actually very interesting. To which the Gemara says, we make a gzir shava of chuka from muchuscha begadim. Just like muchuscha begadim, I will say, applies to all of the avodos, so to again, shtuye yayin, the prohibition to drink wine, also applies to all of the avodos. 1 second, the Gemara says, v'chatana ulahavdil bein kanosiv. So which the Gemara says, but 1 second. Remember that Gzir Shava was brought for what purpose? That Gzir Shava was brought to learn out Mechusar Begadim from Shtuye Yayin. Now you just went ahead. Look at Rashi for just a moment. V'hatana milahavdil kanasiv l'Shtuye Yayin v'lo garam Gzir Shava v'anan neku v'niflo galel l'meilaf mikrachrina. To which the Gemara says, the Gemara Artana learned out the prohibition of shtuye yain from lahavdil ben atame ben atar. Why are you bringing it from chuka? To which the Gemara says, mikame delekom gzera shava. That limud was made when? Ultimately, again, before the gzera shava. So both say the pasuk or the limud from lahavdil ben akodesh ben achol, which teaches me that if kohen drinks wine during the avodah, it profanes the avodah. So we'll say, so the idea that applies to all avodos, so that was the initial limud. After the Gemara makes the Gzera Shava, we then choose to learn it out from the Gzera Shava. But says the Gemara, but 1 second. But again, we'll say that Gzera Shava of Chuka was what? Was used to learn out Mechusar Begadim from Shtuye Yayin to teach me that just as if a kohen drinks wine, the avodah is puzzle, so to what? If he doesn't wear the requisite begadim, the avodah is possible. Now what you're telling me is what? Now you're using the Gzera Shava the opposite way. Now you're using it to teach me that just as mechusar begadim is as possible b'chol ha'avodos, so to shtuye yayin is asur b'chol ha'avodos as well. So again, v'hatana mechusar begadim hu dekayalav mishtuye yayin. We use the Gzera Shava to learn how mechusar begadim from shtuye yayin. Now you're using it to reverse. Hachi kamar. So this is what it means to say. Minayin shel nechlaku bein mechusar begadim l'shtuye yayin v'shel rachasayim v'raglayim. We'll say, how do we know that in halacha we make no distinction ultimately again between mechusar begadim, shtuye yayin, and shel rachatz yadayim v'raglayim? So we'll say these three areas of halacha. Number one, mechusar begadim, which means the kohen who operates again without proper kohanic clothing. Shtuye yayin, the kohen who drank wine. Shel rachatz yadayim v'raglayim, or if a kohen did not wash his hands and his feet. So we'll say, how do I know that in all of these cases, failure to comply with these kohanic obligations ultimately invalidate the avodah? Talmud lomar chuka l'gzera shava. So I'll say that gzera shava chuka allows us to learn out all of these things. That halacha lemaisa, whether you're not wearing the proper clothing, or whether you drank wine, or whether you failed to wash your hands and feet, the avodah will be possible. Ella lahavdil lamali. So we'll say this is very interesting. So now that we're learning out everything from chuka, or you seem to have an extra pasuk. What's the extra pasuk? So let's remember again, what did we originally use that pasuk for? That pasuk originally taught us that if a kohen does the avoda after having consumed wine, the avoda is pasuk. Because remember, the previous pasuk is yain v'shechra al teisht atu uvanecha itach bava. So Torah says, don't drink wine when you're on the job, right? Don't drink wine when you're serving as the kohen. Okay, now that tells me it's usher. It doesn't tell me what. It doesn't tell me that the avoda is pasul. Therefore, the pasuk comes along and says, to teach you that the avoda is pasul as well. Now what we're saying is, I don't need the pasuk to teach me that if you drank wine, the avoda is pasul. Why not? Why not? Because I have chuka, I have the gzeir shava. So if I have the gzeir shava, then what do I do with this pasuk? We'll say, watch this. So so what do I need the pasuk for? L'chid Rav. We'll say, listen to this. This comes to teach us the halacha of Rav. Why? What did Rav do? It's actually quite amazing. The Rav lo mokim amora alei miyom otav lechavre. I both say Rav would not go ahead and lo mokim amora alei literally means he would not go ahead and set up his amora. Both say amora is like a spokesman. Called a spokesman. So we'll say that the Tana used to give over a halacha or give over a concept. Now the Tana didn't necessarily know how to articulate it in a way that would be, intellectually digestible to the masses. So he had an Amora, and the Amora's job was to take perhaps a complicated concept and to package it a little bit differently so that it could be understood by the masses. So Rav would not have his Amora on from one day of Yom Tov to the next, which is another way of saying that Rav wouldn't give shir on Yom Tov. Why wouldn't Rav give shir on Yom Tov? Mishum shichrus. Ultimately, again, because of drunkenness. Look at Rashi for just a moment. It's in the wide lines of Rashi, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines down. Lamoki mamora ale, lemedrash bepirkin, he wouldn't give shir. Miyamatav lechavre. Misha sha'achal v'shasa v'asa yamtov, ad lamachar. From the time that Rav sat down for his Suda on Yom Tov until the next day, he wouldn't give shir. Why? Dahachi mashmakra, yain v'shecha al teisht bevo'achem. V'chein b'shasha atabala havdil olahoros bin davar kidusha l'davar chol al tishichos. We'll say, listen to this. So Rav understood on Yom Tov there's a mitzvah of samachta v'chagecha. One of the ways in which we feel that mitzvah is how I will say with yayin and basar. Therefore, what Rav would not give shir on Yom Tov day after the Suda out of a fear that he would drink a lot over the course of the Suda. So what's the issue? So the way Rav understands it is as follows. Rav understands that the Torah is teaching me two different things. Yain v'shecha al teish teaches me that there's a prohibition to do the avoda after having consumed wine. Then the pasuk says, "Ulahavdil ben hakodesh uben hachol uben hatam ben hatar." It's also teaching you what? That this prohibition doesn't just apply to avoda. What else does it apply to? The paskening of halacha. The paskening of halacha, that ultimately, again, one should also not go ahead and engage in the paskening of halacha, which is lahavdil ben hakodesh and hachol, to distinguish between kodesh and chol, between tameh and tahar, after one has consumed wine. So we'll say, so in other words, what we're saying over here is as follows. The idea that if you consume wine, it invalidates the avoda, so that's not from the Gzeir Shavav Chuka, and now what we're saying over here is that the pasuk Lahavdil ben HaKodesh ben HaChol teaches me that even aside from kahuna, one should not paskin halacha, as evidenced by the fact that Rab did not give shir after he had his Su'uda on Yom Tiv, once one has consumed wine. To which the Gemara says, Akati mehacha nafka, but one second, do we learn this from here? Mehasa nafka. Rashi says over here, Mehacha nafka mechusar begadim. But do we learn out bechusar begadim from here? Mehasam nafka. We learn it out from elsewhere. Where do we learn it out from? So again, so now what we're up to now is our third source for the Isser of mechusar begadim. The Gemara started out with one, we then transitioned to the Gzeir Shavav Chuka. Now the Gemara says, but one second, we learn it out elsewhere. Where do we learn it out from? V'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen. So we'll say the pasuk says over here. It's actually the pasuk is V'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish al hamizbeach va'archu eitzim ala ish. So the sons of Aaron hakohen will place a fire on the mizbeach and they will arrange the wood on the mizbeach. To which the Gemara says, Limeid al kohen. What is this? What does this teach me? Limeid al kohen gadol shalavash big. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Hasam nafka v'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen bikihu no. So we'll say what's interesting is as follows. What the Gemara seems to be darshaning over here is like this, that phrase of Aaron HaKohen, right, is ultimately, again, seems to be a bit extraneous. Why does the Torah have to say, V'nasnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen, to teach me that what? Bikihu no, that the Kohen must be in his Kohanic state when going ahead and performing any aspect of the avodah. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Bikihu no, v'shah shomalubash begadav, nikra Aaron HaKohen, v'lo kishu lavosh bigdei hedyot. So we'll say the idea is, when is ultimately he called Aaron HaKohen? Bikihu no, when he is dressed properly. Now we'll say the Gemara learns that something additional from this, which is, not only does the Kohen have to wear bigdei kahuna, but what? Limeid al Kohen gadol shalavash bigdei Kohen hedyot va'avod avodasa psula. We'll say not only does the Kohen have to wear bigdei kahuna, but what? But what? He has to wear his bigdei kahuna. So, for example, again, if the Kohen gadol wears the begadim of a Kohen Hedyot, Shabbos we'll discuss the differences in the begadim, but if the Kohen wore the begadim of the Kohen Hedyot, ultimately, again, the avodah is possible. So not only must a Kohen wear bigdei kahuna at the time of the avodah, but the Kohen must wear his bigdei kahuna at the time of the avodah. Imi hasam, but I will say, but for our purposes, what do we see? We're dashing from this V'nasnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen, this one word bikihu no, that for a Kohen to be a Kohen, it has to be bikihu no, has to be in this Kohanic state. Kohanic state as defined as wearing bigdei kahuna. So another source for the concept that a Kohen must do the avodah and the bigdei kahuna, to which the Gemara says, Ime hasam, if I would have learned that from there, hava amino, hanimili avodah de ma'akva kapara. So we'll see how we learned that from this pasuk. I would have thought that when does the obligation to wear bigdei kahuna apply? Only when the Kohen is doing a form of avodah de ma'akva kapara, which is an essential part to the kapara of the individual. Aval avoda deloma akva kapara. I will say, if there is an avoda that is not ma'akiv kapara, right? If there is an avoda, ultimately, again, what I will say, that is not essential for the kapara, then ultimately low, then perhaps again halacha l'maisa, one would not be obligated to go ahead and wear the bigdei kahuna. Kamash on that is not the case. So therefore, again, I will say this particular source is not authoritative enough ultimately to learn this halacha. Bakati nafka, but still, again, do we learn it from that original source? Mehasam nafka. The Gemara brings down another pasuk. Where do we learn that from? Va'archu b'nei Aaron hakohanim es hanesachim. So the pasuk says that the bnei Aaron, the sons of Aaron, will go ahead and will arrange the nesachim. Well, ultimately, again, it will arrange the nesachim. Literally means like the cut pieces of the carbon, es harosh v'es hapadar. So the Gemara goes on and says, what's the drush of Rabbi Say? Hakohanim bekihunan. So we'll say it's the same type of drush as before. Why the constant need? See, if you tell me that they're bnei Aaron, then what? Then what? I know they're kohanim. There is no need to go ahead and say bnei Aaron kohanim. That word kohanim is extra. So what are we doing with that word kohanim? Bekihunan. To teach me that they are only called kohanim, or they can only operate as kohanim when? Bekihunan. When they are in a kohanic state. What is the definition of being in a kohanic state? Mikan lekohen hedyot shalavash bigdei kohen gadol va'avad avodasa psula. We'll say so. Kihunan, the Gemara darshans to mean what? When they're wearing their bigdei kahuna. But again, like we said before, not only do they have to wear their bigdei kahuna, but what? They have to wear the bigdei kahuna which is unique to them. Which teaches me that if a kohen hedyot wears the begadim of a kohen gadol, right? A regular kohen wears the begadim of a kohen gadol, ult va'avad avodasa, and he did the avoda will be pasul. So both say so. Again, we see from here bekihunan. Imi hasam. So the Gemara says once again, if we learn out the psul b'dei kahuna from here, so hava amina hanimili chaser aval yiturlo. So you both say, I might have thought. See, this is very interesting. I might have thought that halacha lemaisa, if a kohen doesn't wear the right begadim, that's only if he wears too few of the bigdei kahuna. But for argument's sake, if he wears more than the required bigdei kahuna, what would be the example of that? Example would be a kohen hedyot who wears the bigdei kohen gadol, which is more than what he is required to. Perhaps again that should not invalidate the avoda. Kamashmal and Rabba say kashlan that halacha lemaisa, that is not the case. So we'll say, so bottom line for our purposes is, if a kohen is not wearing the proper begadim, ultimately again the avodah is pasul. The Rambam Paskins by not only is the avodah pasul, but he's also chayiv misa. which is a different discussion which we will get into. So ultimately, again, the avodas puzzle. Where do we learn it out from? So the Gemara seems to bring down 4 different sources, although the most authoritative among them seems to be the Gzeir Shava of Chuka, which teaches me that just as Shtuya Yayin, Rechitzes Dayim Raglayim, if you don't do it, or I should say Shtuya Yayin if you drink, or Rechitzes Dayim Raglayim if you don't wash your hands and feet, the avodas puzzle. So too if the kohen does not wear the big day kahuna, the avodas puzzle as well. Not only that, it is not enough for the kohen to wear a big day kahuna. The kohen has to what? He has to wear the proper big day kahuna. If halacha l'maisa, again, a kohen gadol wears the begadim of a kohen hedyot wears the begadim of a kohen gadol. Ultimately, again, the avodah will be puzzle as well. Thirdly, from ulahavdol ben hakodesh ben hachol, we also learn out Rav's halacha that just as a kohen may not go ahead and do the avodah after he drinks wine, so too again the Talmid Chacham may not paskin halacha b'shas shechras. And we're going to see a distinction between that. For avodah, I will say, as soon as a kohen drinks a revius of wine, we'll discuss this, he's really not permitted to do the avodah for a little while. For obviously passing of halacha, so a revius of wine is not the problem, right? Remember again, Rav only wouldn't give shir on Yom Tiv, when again there was a much greater wine consumption occurring during that time. So it's different shiurim, but the concept is the same. Same way the avodah, the kohen gadol can't, or I should say, the kohen can't do the avodah when he drinks wine. The Talmid Chacham can't paskin halacha when he has consumed too much wine as well. Good. Tan Rabbanan. We'll say now we're going to get into some of the details of the Beit HaKahuna, which is really interesting. So Tan Rabbanan, Hayu Merushalim. We'll say what happens if the kohen gadol's clothing. So okay, now we've established that the kohen must do the avodah with big day kahuna. Now we're going to speak a little bit about the specifications of the begadim. It's really an amazing Gemara. Hayu Merushalim. We'll say what happens if the clothing, Merushalim Rashi says, is nigrarim bekarka. Clothing was too long. Or misulakim. The clothing was too short. Mishuchakim. We'll say mishuchakim means, if you look at Rashi, mishuchakim yishanim. They were older. In other words, we'll say lav davka tattered, just older, maybe a bit more worn out. So what's the halacha in all of these cases? Va'avad avadaso, and you did the avodah kshera. So I'll say even if the clothing was too long, too short, or a bit worn out, the avodah is still kosher. Lava shnei mechnasayim, but if the kohen wore 2 pairs of pants, shnei avneitim, 2 belts, chaser achos, yiser achos, or he was missing one of the big day kahuna, or added on something additional, osha haisalo ritia amakas basar tachas begado, or he was wearing a bandage on his flesh, so that the clothing wasn't resting directly on his flesh. Osha hayu mitushtashin. We'll say, or, for example, again, the clothing was, Rashi says, mishtushtashin means bitit, it was dirty. His clothing was dirty. O mikurain, or the clothing was ripped. Va'avad avadasa. We'll say, in any of these cases, did the avodah. What's the halacha? The halacha is the avodah is psula. So again, if the clothing is too long, too short, or too worn out, it's kosher. But if he wore too many articles of clothing, was missing an article of clothing, right, or had something, or the clothing wasn't resting on his flesh, or the clothing was dirty, or the clothing was torn, and he did the avodah, ultimately, again, the avodah is possible. I'm going to show. So we'll say that's the first thing. We're going to see there's going to be a number of opinions here. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So we'll say Shmuel comes along and says, Merushalim ksherin, misulakim psulin. We'll say that's very interesting. Shmuel says, if the clothing is too long, then they will still be kosher. But if the clothing is too short, it will be pasul. I've hatanya misulakim ksherin. But we just said before, we'll say the first part of this brisa said that what? That if the clothing is too long, if the clothing is too short, it will be kosher. So we'll say, remember again, the brisa that we just read before said if the clothing is too long or too short, ultimately again the avodah will still be kosher. Shmuel saying if it's too long, it's kosher. If it's too short, it's pasul. Ayvatanya misulakin ksherin. But we said before in the brisa that if the clothing is too short, it's kosher. Amarami Barachama lo kasha. So this is actually a very interesting distinction. Barachama says it's not a contradiction. How so? Kansha silkan al yedei avneit kan delesnu meikara klal. So we'll say, listen to this. When the brisa said that if the clothing is too short, it is kosher, we'll say, when is that? That's when, let's say again, the tunic or the pants are the right length. What happens? The kohen bunches it up by his belt. so that it turns out that it looks too short, but in fact, again, it has the requisite length. So when it has the requisite length, in other words, we'll say when it was the proper sizing, but the Kohen was just wearing it in an awkward way that bunched it up by the belt, so therefore it appeared to be too short, that's when it's going to be kosher. But if lemaisa, again, it's just too short, or it's that the measurements, the length of it is just incorrect, then lemaisa, again, it will be possible. Take a look at Rashi. Kancha silkan ayide avnate. So Rashi says very interesting. He says kederach shanashim osos. So he says like the way that women do. I guess he's referring maybe if a woman wants to make her skirt a little bit shorter, so she could pull it up at the waist. So too again the Kohen, if he goes ahead and he wants to make the pants shorter, he bunches it up by the belt. So we'll say so. The Gemara. So this is actually very interesting. The Gemara is making and we're going to see this. This is going to come back in just a little bit. So the idea over here, according to Rabbi Bar Chama, is that what we look for is, do the pants have the requisite length? When we say pants, by the way, it's the pants and the tunic. Does it have the requisite length or not? If it has the requisite length, then even if he's wearing it short, so to speak, it's fine. If it doesn't have the requisite length, then ultimately, again, it will be invalid. So the Gemara says as follows. Rav disagrees with Shmuel, and Rav says, Echad zeh ve'echad zeh psulin. Both Rav will say whether, again, it's too short because you bunched it up at the belt, or whether it's too short because what? Because lemaisa, again, it has the wrong length, it will be possible. So we'll say what Rav seems to be saying is as follows, and this is quite interesting. Rav says that at the end of the day, we look at how not only the actual dimensions or measurements of the clothing, but we're also looking at what? How it presents. Right? If it doesn't present in the right way, then ultimately the avoda will be possible, even if the measurements are correct. So fundamental machlokes, Rav and Shmuel. So we'll say, let's go. Rav Huna ikla. Listen, this is really very interesting Gemara. Rav Huna ikla la Argiza. So Rav Huna went to Argiza as a place. Rav Huna went to the place of Argiza. Ramalei bar ushbezichna. So we'll say, so the son of his host, so he's staying at someone's house, and the son of his host asked him the following question: Mi amar Shmuel merushalan ksherin musulakin psulin. Did Shmuel really say that if the Kohanic clothing is too long, it's kosher, but if it's too short, it's possible? Vatanya, but we have a brisa that says misulakin ksherin. Right? The brisa says whether the clothing is too long or too short, it's kosher. So Amrlei bar minei. So Rav Huna said to this young man, don't worry about this brisa. Why? The Shanye Rami Bar Chama. Because remember, Rabbi Bar Chama already answered it up. Right, the brisa that said that even if it's too long, it's kosher. Right, even if it's too short, it's kosher. That's talking about where the Kohen bunched it up by the belt, but the length is really correct. Whereas Shmuel, when he said that if it's too short, it's pasul, that was referring to what? Where the pants or the tunic itself lacks the requisite requirements. El Rav Kasha. But we'll say, what does Rav do? Because remember, again, the brisa says that if the Kohanic clothing is too long or too short, it's still kosher. Rav said if it's too long or it's too short, it's what? It's pasul. So what does Rav do with the brisa? V'chi tema my mirushalanu misulakin ayide avnate. So we'll say. So maybe you'll say as follows: what does it mean when we talk about the clothing being too long or too short? We'll say maybe that's a function of how you wrap the clothing around your belt. Va'avnit megas gayis. So we'll say, so listen to this. Maybe the case of where the clothing is too long and that it's still kosher is as follows, where it's too long, but you bunch it up by the belt. So if you bunch it up by the belt, then what? It makes it short enough. Va'avneit megas gayis. And I will say, we view the bunching up of the belt as what? As a cutting down of the clothing. Or maybe what we do is, we view it that when you bunch up around the belt, that's as if you cut the clothing down to size, and therefore the clothing fits. Well, if that's the case, Ella misulakin kasha. We'll say, here's the problem with that. The problem with that then is if the clothing is too short, because you've wrapped it around the belt, then what? That's also as if you've cut the clothing down, and if you've cut the clothing down, then it should be pasul. To which the Gemara says, Amar Avizera, Rav Chadatani. Rav in reality quoted one halacha. Well, so what did Rav say? Mirushalin shasilkon al yedei avneit ksherin. What Rav really meant to say was as follows: that if you have clothing that is too long, shasilkon al yedei avneit, that you shortened through the belt, which Rabbi means again, you're wrapping it underneath the belt. Remember again, Rabbi just so you understand, the avneit was worn on. Kohen wears michnasayim, he wears pants. Again, we'll get into this. He wears pants, and then on top of that, he wears exones. He wears like a tunic, and then on top of that is the avnet, is the belt. So the idea that Rav is saying is as follows: if your Kohen had pants that were too long, and what happens? You wrap them up around the belt, or really underneath the belt, and as a result, you shorten them. So now they're the right length. Ksherin. Ultimately, again, those begadim will be kosher. Why, Rabbi saying? Because again, as we're going to see, Rav holds that anything wrapped underneath the belt is as if it's been cut down to size, and therefore, again, halacha lamaisa, the begadim have the requisite measurements. Amr Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti, mirushalin shalos silkon tanahi. Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti says, in reality, if you have clothing, long clothing, that has shalos silkon, which means have not been wrapped underneath the belt, ultimately, again, as a machlokes, I'm supposed to say, here's what we have. So it turns out that what's occurring over here is that Rav is not really arguing as much as he's making a definitive statement. Rav is saying that if you have kohanic clothing that are too long and you wrapped it underneath the belt, the begadim will be kosher. Why? Because the act of wrapping it underneath the belt, Rav says, no different than what? Tailoring it, right? And everybody agrees that if you tailored it, ultimately the begadim will be good. So Rav says also if you tucked it underneath the belt, that's like tailoring, and therefore will be kosher. So comes over Yomi Difti and he says as follows: if you have clothing that is too long, that you did not make shorter, it's a machlokes tanaim. Watch this. So we'll say this actually opens up another door for us. This is actually very exciting. This sanya al arba kanfos ksuska. So pasuk says we'll say by tzitzis. Gedilim tas seloch al arba kanfos kesuscha asher techasebo. We'll say tzitzis on the four corners of your garment. Al arba kanfos kesuscha. So what do we darshan from here? Arba below shalosh. This teaches us that what? That halacha l'maisa, a beged is only chayiv in tzitzis, or we'll say what? If it has four corners. 4 and not 3. O eino ela arba below chamesh. Maybe he's teaching me 4 and not 5. Kishu omer asher techaseba. But also when the pasuk says that we're talking about a garment that you're going to cover yourself in, Harei ba'alos chamesh amar. We'll say that tells you that even a 5-cornered garment will be chayiv in tzitzis. Ha ma'ani mekayim arba. So why does the Torah say dafka 4? Arba v'lo shalosh. The teaching that what? It is only a 4-cornered garment and not a 3-cornered garment will be chayiv in tzitzis. Uma royis l'rambos balos chamesh l'hotzi balos shalosh. So why is it that we know the Torah tells me a 4-cornered garment? How do I know that 4-cornered comes to exclude 3 and not 5? How do I know that? To which the Gemara says, Marbani balas chamesh sheyesh bechlal chamesh arba. Because also I will include a 5-cornered garment. Why? Because 5 automatically includes what? 4. Umotziani balas shalosh shein bechlal shalosh arba. And I will exclude a 3-cornered garment because ultimately, again, a 3-cornered garment does not include 4. Okay. V'tanya idach. We'll say I have another brayso that says as follows. So we'll say, so from this brayso I see that when it says 4 excludes 3, but doesn't exclude 5. Why doesn't it exclude 5? Because 5 includes 4. So you see by definition that a garment that has more than 4 corners will be chayiv in tzitzis, because once it is 4 and above, by definition, the beged is all inclusive. Watch this. V'tanya idach. Another brayso. Al arba kanfos ksuscha. Pasuk says you shall put tzitzis on the 4-cornered garment. Arba v'lo shalosh. Arba v'lo chamesh. Ooh. Both in this brayso it says what? It is not only is a 3-cornered garment excluded from tzitzis, but what? A 5-cornered garment as well. Right? So we'll say, so you see the difference. So you see the machlokes in the brayso. Brayso number 1, a 5-cornered garment is not excluded. In brayso number 2, a 5-cornered garment is excluded. My love b'hakam eflagi. We'll say, what are they arguing about? Dimar savar yeser kiman diise dami umar savar kiman delese dami. So we'll say, so what are they arguing about? That one opinion holds that we view that 5th corner as if it exists, and one opinion holds that we view the 5th corner as if it doesn't exist. And we'll say, now look at Rashi for just a moment. It's Rashi almost right across. Mar savar man de pater balos chamesh. The one who says ultimately again that a 5-cornered garment is pater from tzitzis savar lo amrinan yeser kiman delese, says that we don't view something extra as if it doesn't exist. Ela kiman diisehu v'lo karina le bas arba uman de mechayosir le yeser kiman delese dami. So we'll say, watch this. The fundamental machlokes we'll say is as follows. What happened? According to one opinion, Once a garment is 4 corners, we don't care how many corners you put on there afterwards. It doesn't make a difference to us. Once you've reached the threshold of being a 4-cornered garment, you're chayav in tzitzis. Any other corners above the 4th, we view as if they're even non-existent. The other opinion says, no, the obligation is dafka on what? A 4-cornered garment. Once you have more than 4 corners, then what? You're no longer a 4-cornered garment, and therefore, again, not chayav in tzitzis. We'll say, what does that have to do with us? So we'll say, what happens if the kohana clothing is too long? So we'll say, so essentially we'll say it's the same machlokes. One opinion will say, once it reaches the requisite length, then what? We don't really view anything beyond the requisite length, and therefore the big dekuna, even if they're too long, will be kasher. Whereas the other opinion will say, no, we view everything that's part of the kohana clothing, and if it's too long, it will be possible. To which the Gemara says, no, not a good comparison. Tichuli alma command, you say dummy. It will say, you can't ignore reality as much as many people try. And therefore, again, even in the 5th corner, you can't ignore the 5th corner, just like you can't ignore the additional length of the kohana clothing. V'shayni hacha, the Rabbi Rachmana asher techaseba. We'll say tzitzis is different, because by tzitzis, we'll say, even though it says 4 corners, it also calls the garment what? Asher techaseba. It calls it a garment that you are clothing yourself in. So because of that, again, that could come to include even a 5-cornered garment, according to some at least, as a garment that is obligated in tzitzis. V'idach, haya asher techaseba on my avid. So we'll say, but if you don't hold that a 5-cornered garment is chayav in tzitzis, so nu, what do you do with this pasuk asher techaseba? To which the Gemara says, first wide line, we'll say you need it for the following. Listen to this. We'll say it's actually fascinating. Uri isim also. The pasuk by tzitzis says, you shall see the tzitzis. Prat l'ksus laila. We'll say this comes to exclude a garment worn at night. That a garment worn at night is not chayav in tzitzis. So for example, if you got your brand new 4-cornered pair of pajamas, mazel tov, you got your 4-cornered pajamas, you don't have to put tzitzis on them. Why not? Because the pasuk by tzitzis says it's dafko re'isem also, when you see them, which teaches us that what? That the obligation of tzitzis is only on garments worn by day, but not by garments worn at night. Prat l'ksus laila. Oh, eino ella, second line, prat l'ksus suma. Well, so maybe not. Maybe it comes to exclude what? A blind person's garments. We'll say maybe a blind person is not obligated to put tzitzis on his garments. Why? Because the Lamaisa can't see them. No, when the pasuk says that you have to put tzitzis on a garment that you clothe yourself in, harei ksus suma. So we'll say even a suma clothes himself. The fact that he can't see it, okay, but lamaisa asher techaseba, he's still clothing himself in it. So the Gemara says, "Hamani mekayim urisim also." So if asher techaseba, we'll say teaches me that what? Well, this is very important. Asher techaseba teaches me that even a suma is obligated to put tzitzis on his clothing. If that's the case, then what do I do with uri isem also? Prat l'ksus laila. We'll say so isem also. So asher techaseba teaches me that even a suma is obligated to put tzitzis on his clothing. Uri isem also teaches me that what Rabbi is saying, that ksus laila, clothing worn by night, is not chayiv in tzitzis. Umarois the rabbos ksus suma lo ksus laila. About why is it? How do I know to include the clothing of a blind person and to exclude clothing worn by night? To which I'll tell you why. See, Rabbi say, remember again, the clothing of a suma may not be seen by the suma, but is seen by who? By everyone else. Rabbi say, I'll exclude ultimately ksus laila, clothing worn at night. So we'll say, because no one sees it. Again, right, at night no one sees the clothing. The other opinion we'll learn this out, we'll say from the word asher, and the second opinion does not dash asher. We'll say, just so you should know, this is halacha l'maisa, the way we paskin. That halacha l'maisa, again, that a ksus laila. So if somebody has 4-cornered pajamas, ultimately, again, that baguette is not chayiv in tzitzis. The 4-cornered baguette of a summa will be chayiv in tzitzis. So first of all, we still have to figure out how we paskin halal. So we just got into a fascinating tzitzis detour, but aside from that, we still have to figure out ultimately what? How we paskin this machlokes Rabbi Shmuel, or how we paskin in general in Big Dekuna. We have two. Here's what everybody agrees with. If the clothing is dirty, or if the clothing is torn, the avodah is pasul. The point of contention, Rabbi seems to be with what? Mirushalin misulakin. if the clothing is too long, if the clothing is too short. Ultimately, again, what do you do with the clothing under those circumstances? So let's just do a little bit more Gemara, then we'll see halacha l'maisa. Tan Rabbana. So we'll say the Gemara says a couple of more details regarding the big day kahuna. Bad. The pasuk, as we'll see, tells us that the kohen needs to be bad. What does that teach me? Shihu shel butz. The kohanic clothing has to be made of linen. Bad shiu chadashim. Furthermore, again, the kohanic clothing has to be new. Bad, as well. Remember again, the pasuk refers to the big day kahuna as bad. So we're discussing what does it teach you when it has to be bad. So bad has to be of linen. Bad, it has to be new. Bad shiu shizurim. It has to be made of twisted thread. Bad shiu chutan kafel shisha. Furthermore, the thread, as we're going to see, has to be 6-fold thread. Each piece of thread is folded over 6 times, as we'll discuss. Bad shelo yilbash shel chol imahen. Bad means that when wearing kohanic clothing, the kohen can't wear any weekday, literally big day begadim shel chol. Now weekday is non-consecrated clothing. You can't wear any non-consecrated clothing with it. Amar Rabbi Rav Yosef, bishlama shiu shel butz. So I understand ultimately again that the kohanic clothing has to be of linen. Hakamash malon butz in midi achrina lo. So we'll say that teaches me that what it has to be made of linen and not of any other material. Elabachu chadoshim in shechakin lo. So when it tell me that one of the other drushos of bad is that the clothing has to be new, which shows me new, yes, but worn out, no. But one second, we'll say, what did we learn in the Bryson Amud Aleph? Vatanya mishuchakin ksherim. And we'll say we learned in Amud Aleph that what? That even if the kohanic clothing is worn out, that it is still kosher. To which the Gemara says, Amar lei ulatamech bad shiu chutan kafel shisha. Bad chad l'chudei mashma. But I can ask the same question. The Bryce before just darshan that what I will say. What do you learn from bad? That every thread has to be 6-ply thread. But yet I say the word bad itself seems to indicate to us what? Chad l'chudei seems to indicate to us that what? That lamaisa each string should be an independent thread. Elachi kamar. This is what it means to me. This is what it means to say. Hachi kamar. Begadim shneimar behind bad. The Gemara is quoting a statement, quoting a principle. Any time, right, when the Torah discusses clothing that has to be bad, what's the definition of that? Tzrichin shiu shel butz chadoshim. They have to be made of brand new linen. Shizurin sheichutan kafel shisha. It's woven in that it has to be made of 6-ply thread. So yeshmehen lamitzvah, yeshmehen la'akev. And as we will see, some of these details are a mitzvah, which means l'chatchila it has to be done this way, and some of them are ma'akev. Some of them, if they're not done this way, what? Invalidate the begadim. So we'll say again, right now all the Gemara is doing is just laying down this series of rules, not telling us necessarily how we learn them out. Mimai the high bad kisnu. So we'll say, Gemara says, 1 second, how do you know that bad? When the Torah says that the big dick would have to be of bad, how do you know that bad means linen? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, davar ha'olam min akarka bad bebad. It refers to the Kohanic vestments have to be made from something that comes out of the ground, one stalk. Each stalk is an individual. Look at Rashi. Holam min akarka bad bebad. Kani yechidi mikol gizeh ve'in beis kanam oltzem gizeh echad. So it refers to a plant, we'll say, where what? Each stalk comes up as an individual, and 2 stalks never come up as one. Apparently, again, what type of plant ultimately, again, comes up 1 stalk and never 2 stalks from one is apparently linen. Ema imra, say it refers to wool. I will say, how would that refer to wool? Because when each piece of wool comes out of the sheep, each little strand of wool comes out from its own pore, just like hair. So to which the Gemara says, Imra miftzal. Look at Rashi, just miftzal. Hanema misfatzelas and mischalekes l'shnayim agai behemei Allah. So we'll say the issue with wool is that even though it's one hair that comes out of one pore, the wool ultimately splits. To which the Gemara says, kisna nami miftzal. Ultimately, linen also splits into multiple threads. Aide lakusa miftzal. We'll say naturally linen grows as one thread. So what you do is you beat the linen afterwards and it splits apart into multiple threads. Ravina Amar Mehacha. Ravina says, Rabbi say, we learn out the obligation from linen from here. The Gemara quotes the pasuk from Yecheskel. Fe'ere pishtim yu arosham, u'michnese pishtim yu amasnehem, lo yachgeru beyaza. Shabbos say we learn over here from Yecheskel. The Rabbi Yecheskel says explicitly that the Kohanic clothing has to be made of pishtim, which is the definite, which defines as linen. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Amalei Ravashi Ravina. Vaha Ada Asi Yecheskel Minala. All right, very nice. What about before Yecheskel came along? Where do we know this from? In other words, Yecheskel is one of the Nevi'im. That's very nice, right? So how do I know before Yecheskel that the Kohanim had to wear linen? Ulatamech. But using that same logic, Hadam Rav Chisda Davar Zemi Toras Moshe Rabbeinu Lo Lamadnu. I'm sorry. Ulatamech Hadam Rav Chisda Davar Zemi Toras Moshe Rabbeinu Lo Lamadnu. Medivrei Yecheskel Ben Muzi Lamadnu. Supposed to listen to this. Called Ben Nechar Ora Leiva Ora Basar Lo Yavo Mikdashi L'Sharseni. Ad Sheba Yecheskel. I will say, how do I know that a Kohen? Now here, actually, the pasuk talks about two things. The Kohen talks about a Kohen who is an Orel, an uncircumcised Kohen. So we'll say the pasuk over talks about two types of Arelim: uncircumcised heart and uncircumcised flesh. So we'll say, the uncircumcised heart is talking about a Jew or a Kohen who has veered away from the Derech Hashem. We'll discuss that more tomorrow. But a Kohen who's uncircumcised, Rabbi say, he can't do the avoda. Before Yecheskel, how did I know that? Ela Gimar Gmirila. So we'll say, rather, these things are halachos l'Moshe Misinai. The Kohanic clothing has to be made of linen, and a Kohen who is an Arel can't do the avoda. These are things that are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Yecheskel came along and instituted them in a pasuk. So el Gemara Gemirila va'asi Yecheskel va'as mecheakra. Hachanam and by the Kohanic clothing you have to be made of linen. Gemara Gemirila. Ultimately, it's a tradition, but Yecheskel went ahead and codified it in a pasuk. We'll also have to stop here for today. We'll pick up at Mirat Hashem with the rest of this sugya tomorrow.
Rabbi Shai, we sent an email regarding the siyum. If you could please respond today so we can get numbers.